prosperity is an attempt to address this problem, what I would call not so much income inequality, but distortions in the way income is distributed in a whole variety of countries. And because of these distortions, the world has probably way too much savings given its investment level and way too low consumption. And this is a big problem in China. But as I'll explain in a minute, Beijing is trying to resolve the American version or the European version of income inequality in China, when in fact the problem in China is quite different. And to understand that, let's go back a little bit. We've been talking about rebalancing the Chinese economy since basically 2007. And as you know, the big problem in the Chinese economy is because the household share of GDP is so low, perhaps the lowest we've ever seen, excluding one or two Arab oil sheikdoms, the consumption share is also very low. And as a result, the saving share is very high. And high savings are a good thing to have when you are underinvested, which China was in the 1980s and 1990s until about maybe 15 years ago. The problem is that once China closed the gap between the amount of investment it had and the amount of invested it could productively absorb, it ran into a problem. And the problem is that with consumption such a low share of GDP, you still rely on high levels of investment in order to generate growth. And those high levels of investment are increasingly non-productive. By the way, in July, Xi Jinping published a very important article in Chu, which is the theoretical journal of the Communist Party, in which it's called the New Development Model, in which he talked very specifically about the difference between genuine growth and fictional growth. And this is something that we've been talking about. I've been talking about this for nearly a decade, and I would say that there are people within Beijing that have recognized this distinction for at least 4 or 5 years. But to have Xi Jinping himself acknowledge that there is such a thing as fictional growth and there's too much of it in China, I think is a very powerful recognition that this growth model no longer works and we need to adjust it. But as I said, we've been talking about adjusting it since at least 2007. Now, last year, Xi Jinping presented a new concept, the dual circulation model. And dual circulation basically means there are two forms of circulation. There's international circulation, basically exports, and then there's internal circulation, which is basically consumption and business investment directed towards consumption. And the dual circulation model argued that in order to strengthen China's manufacturing base, which is seen as the heart of Chinese success, we're going to strengthen both internal and international circulation. And the problem with that model, and I wrote about this in a Financial Times article, I think in September of last year, the problem with that model is that China's export competitiveness is based largely on the very low household income share of GDP. Basically, workers get a very low share of what they produce. Same thing as in Germany, same thing as in Japan, in South Korea. And when workers are paid, it's not that they're paid low wages. Germany, of course, has high wages, but low wages relative to what they produce. Then those countries become internationally very competitive, and those are all countries with big trade surpluses and very strong export sectors. If you want to strengthen international circulation, you've got to keep wages low. You've got to keep them from catching up to productivity. But if you want to boost domestic consumption, you've got to do the opposite. You've got to raise wages quite sharply. And for me, that was the contradiction at the heart of the dual circulation model. You couldn't do both. You could do one or the other. And by the way, since since he first mentioned dual circulation, exports have exploded and consumption has continued to lag. And not surprisingly, income has continued to lag as a share of GDP. So all of that sort of makes sense. Now, common prosperity is an attempt to redistribute income from the wealthy and from businesses with excess profits to the household sector. But the way they do it is a little bit strange, quite frankly. In Chinese jargon, they talk about three types of distribution: Primary distribution is wages, salaries, interest on your savings, things like that, the direct income you get. Secondary distribution, also called redistribution, are fiscal transfers. And then and that's fine. I mean, we all talk about those things. But then they have a third thing called tertiary distribution, which is basically donations. And the purpose of common prosperity is to use redistribution to a certain extent, but mainly tertiary distribution to rebalance income. We've already seen, coincidence, I'm sure, the number of donations have gone up in the last 3 or 4 months, a number of announced donations. Now, there's several problems with this program. The first problem, as I see it, is sort of a minor problem, but donations are a very small share of economic activity. In the US, where I think they're the highest in the world, it's everything added together is about 2.3%. In China, it's much less than 1/10 of that. So let's say you double it or triple it. That's fine. That helps at the margin, but we're still talking about roughly 0.5% of GDP, which is nowhere near enough distribution to the household sector to really solve the rebalancing problem. China needs to distribute something like 10 to 15 percentage points of GDP. So if we do 0.5%, that's going to take 20 years at least. Formally, they're not saying anything. They're saying, you should donate more. I suspect that there are a lot of discussions about these donations because there have been some pretty big donations made. But that leads us to the second problem with common prosperity is that if you want to redistribute income, you take income, say, from the rich and give it to the poor. But that's not what's happening with the common prosperity. Most of the donations are going into investment into various things like supporting agriculture, et cetera. And that may be a good thing, but understand that from the point of view of rebalancing, you're boosting the supply side, and then part of it, it's sort of a version of trickle down. Part of it then trickles down to the poor, and so you boost demand that way. But in China, you need to boost demand faster than you boost supply. So if you really want this to work, just give them the money, and then demand will go up faster than the supply side. But the really big problem with common prosperity is, as I said earlier, they're solving an American problem or a European problem in a very different Chinese context. In the US or in Europe, households retain directly or indirectly 70 to 80% of GDP. So if there is a problem in the distribution of income, it's probably going to be in the household sector. That's most of GDP. The remaining is mostly a business, and the government sector probably is net zero or net negative slightly. So as I said, if you want to solve the problem of distorted income distribution in the US, go after the income inequality within the household sector. But in China, it's very, very different. In China, the household sector retains roughly 55% of GDP. And then the remaining 45, it's hard to know where businesses start and government stops, et cetera. But broadly speaking, about 20 to 25% of GDP is retained by the government, mostly local governments. Local governments are very powerful in China. And then the rest by businesses. So businesses retain in China more or less what they retain in other countries. It's not so different. But the real distinction between China and the US is that very large government share. So what I would argue is that if you want to rebalance income in China, going after the rich, fine, that can help at the margin, but it's not big enough to really rebalance. You've got ultimately to transfer, as I said, 10 to 15 percentage points of GDP to make China a normal country. And you're not going to get that from the rich because the total household sector is something like 55% of GDP. I mean, of course, if you squeeze the hell out of the rich totally, you'll get it. But I don't think they want to do that either because of the implications for the economy. So if you really want to solve the imbalance in China, it's not going after the rich. Going after the rich is fine. It helps at the margin. But what you really have to do is transfer income from local governments to the household sector. And there's many ways of doing it. But of course, local governments are really, really reluctant to engage in those types of transfers. The power of local elites depends on the ability of local governments to control land, control SOEs, control expenditures, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're talking about is a significant reduction in the income role of local government, and I'd submit to you that also means a significant reduction in the power of local governments. That's not necessarily bad for Beijing, because if you want to centralize power, one of the ways of doing so is to weaken the power of local governments. But it is politically very difficult. And so far, there's no evidence that Beijing is really thinking in those terms. Collective prosperity says nothing about local governments, or it says very little about local governments. It's mostly about redistributing from the rich to ordinary people.